Hello, welcome to the Educatedcollins Snap channel. How you doing? So today we're going to be talking about Jeff Stature. So this is a deck that I've kind of talked about in passing in some of my previous videos, and I'm getting a lot of comments on YouTube and sometimes Reddit where they're like, what is this deck? What is Jeff Stature? Why is Black Bolt in the conversations now, et cetera, et cetera? Well, this is like a new deck that's been kind of showing up in the meta, and it's quite powerful. That's why it's noticeable, because people are playing it, people are winning it, and you're probably losing to it. So it's just a deck that you'll remember. And it's a deck I see a lot, so I definitely want to talk about it. So I made a deck breakdown. Woohoo! So let's get started. So what is Jeff Stature? What is this deck? The name is not, I just made a random name. I think those are the two most important cards. That's why I put them in the title, but it's essentially not a movement deck, but it's a deck that relies on setting up little combos either through movement or discards to have really strong endgame tempo swings. So you're basically relying on either a discard effect, a movement effect, or Zabu's effect to make your cards cheaper. You're essentially creating a Sarah-like turn 6 without playing Sarah. That's another way of looking at it. So you're doing a lot of discounting in the setup early turns so that your final turns feel like you're playing Sarah, but you don't actually have Sarah in your deck. So that's really the main essence of it, and how it really likes to function. So here we have the standard deck list. So Korg, Nightcrawler, Zabu, Jeff, Polaris, Darkhawk, Shang-Chi, Spider-Man, Enchantress, RockSlide, Stature, and Black Bolt. There's not a lot of flexibility. We'll get into that later, but this is the quintessential deck list for this. And if you don't have some of the pieces, I know a lot of people are not going to have Jeff, and a lot of people are not going to have Stature. It's really going to be hard to recommend this list for you to play. There are some alternatives that we're going to get into later, but I would say you're really not playing with the optimal version if you don't have a lot of the more expensive pieces of this deck list. So let's talk about some of the cards. So the first card we're going to be talking about is Jeff. Jeff is a card that sets up your Miles Morales. So Miles Morales gets cheaper to 1 if any card moves last turn, and Jeff has that ability to move. And we do have multiple movement cards just because Jeff might not be able to carry solo, but you have things like Polaris, things like Nightcrawler to be able to set up your Miles Morales. And it's just a card in itself that gives you location and flexibility. It messes with Professor X. It messes with some locations that shut you down. So it's just a very strong card in itself, but just works well with the current deck list that we're running. Next up, we have Stature. So Stature is another core piece, right? Those are the two namesakes of the deck. It's one of your main win conditions, and you're able to, with Black Bolt, make this 1 energy 7 power card, so which just generates large power for very cheap if you have the right setup, and it's definitely one of your main win conditions. So next up, we have Black Bolt. Is another core piece. It gives you the discard needed to play a cheap Stature, and Black Bolt in itself is not bad right now in the meta. A lot of decks tend to flood, and they need their cheap cards to flood with. So you're actually messing with people when you play Black Bolt. So it's actually pretty solid of a card right now, and definitely with the Stature setup. Without Stature, I would say it's not amazing, but with the Stature, definitely a highly rated card. Next up, we have Miles Morales. So this card becomes very cheap and easily playable with a lot of the movement supplemental pieces that we run, Jeff, Nightcrawler, Polaris in this current deck list, and it just kind of gives you another way of flooding in the late game. A 1 power 5 card is not bad at all, and you can definitely have a lot of control with how you want to place your power with Miles. Next up, we have Zabu. This is another core piece. You set up your 4 drops. And really the most important part of this card is it lets you play your 4 on 3, namely RockSlide. But it also does allow for a big tempo turn 6 swing. So you can do something like double 4, or you can do a 4 and multiple 1-cost cards that got discounted. So just Zabu just helps you with your setup and is a really nice piece. And then with Zabu, usually when you see a Zabu, you usually see a Darkhawk. It's just another nice core tempo piece, big win conditions. You get the stats. We're running Korg or running RockSlide, so this thing can become huge. And it's just a nice power swing for your final turns. And then, of course, we have RockSlide. It just buffs up your Darkhawk and then makes your opponent's draw worse, especially if you played earlier. So this can be a very annoying card that really just sets up a lot of your combos. So some of the main concepts is the early game setup. So these cards really set up your finishers in some way by making them cheaper for your final turns. So you need to utilize some of these setups. The main one is Zabu and Black Belt, but you also have 3 location cards in this deck that you can move around. With Mouse, it's a little bit more restrictive because you have to have the movement on the turn before you play Mouse. So if you want to play Mouse on 6, you have to Jeff move on 5, and that's a big tell sometimes, but also just something you have to be aware of. And then the late game flood finisher. So these cards, when set properly, can be played on a final turn very cheaply with big power swings. So that's Darkhawk, Stature, and Mouse. And then you also have these counter tech cards, the Shang-Chi Enchantress, just for those scenarios where you need to destroy something or remove an ongoing. So pretty nice setup there. So how do you pilot? You have to be thinking about your late game turns when you're playing this card, when you're playing this deck, because your late game is really important and your early game really dictates how your late game is going to go. So if you're not playing that Black Bolt, right, you're not going to have that Stature step. If you're not playing that movement, you're not going to have that Mouse step. If you're not playing that Zabu, you know, your Darkhawk step's not going to feel as clean. So Zabu sets up all your 4 drops, and you have a ton of them. It also lets you play a card on 4, usually RockSlide on 3. It's critically important that you usually get a card on 4 because you don't have a lot of good turn 3 options. Except for maybe Polaris. But if you do Polaris, that means you can't use Polaris for your Miles Morales play. So you usually want to rely on Zabu for that. And then Black Bolt sets up Stature. If you don't get to play Black Bolt, you don't get to play Stature very cheaply. So it's a big thing to consider. Okay, when am I playing Black Bolt to play the Stature? I mean, you're playing it on turn 5, right? Unless you somehow get some extra mana or extra power in some way. Miles Morales can be set up by a number of movement cards. Jeff is the most consistent one, but Polaris and Nightcrawler can also perform that job. Nightcrawler can get Killmongered, so it's not super reliable. And then Polaris, you might tempo that out on turn 3, so that's also not the most reliable. But with Jeff, they need to create movement the turn before Miles is played. So Miles discount only lasts 1 turn. So if you don't use the discount on the turn it happens, on the turn after it happens, then you lose it forever. So you have to be careful. You have to make sure your timings are correct to have the Miles Morales effect in the right turn. And then playing Darkhawk early can set you up for being Enchantress or Rogue or Shang-Chi'd. So you do have to be careful if you're tempering out Darkhawk early. Sometimes that's going to be your only play. But you definitely have to be aware, like, oh, if I play it early, well, they can just spend a Shang-Chi and kill my card for free. So you have to be aware of that with your positionings and your location point allocation. So just be careful with that. And then Shang-Chi and Enchantress are just cards used in the final turns to swing locations back into your favor. It does require that you know what your opponent is likely to do, but it can provide great advantages if used correctly. So here we have some powerful plays. So these are just plays that do a lot in this deck. We have the Black Bolt plus Stature combo. That's going to give you a lot of power, 15 power for 6 energy, pretty good. Then we have the Darkhawk setup, Korg, RockSlide, Darkhawk, 20 plus power. Very, very strong combo. And then you have like an example late game flood. You've got the Stature for 1. You've got the Miles Morales for 1. Then you have the Shang-Chi for 3 or 4, depending on what's going on. So you can definitely do that huge, big final turn, kill something, and play tons of power in the same turn. So that's really some of the more powerful combos you can do with this deck. Then here we have some of the flexible pieces from meta. Honestly, there's not a lot of flexibility in this deck. We're going to talk about it in the next slide, but you can change out the tech cards for different tech cards. Maybe you don't want to play Shang-Chi, you want to play Super Scroll or whatever. And Nightcrawler isn't the most important card in this deck. It's really not that necessary, especially if you have Jeff. If you don't have Jeff, then maybe it's more important, but especially if you have Jeff, you don't really need a Nightcrawler, but that's the standard deck list and what most people are playing with, so I'm just kind of showing you what is there. Now, I do want to mention this is not a flexible deck. This is not. It's a deck that is expensive. It's a deck that requires lots of specific cards, and the cards have to combo together in some way. So there's not a lot of wiggle room in terms of changing out one card for another. There are some things you can do, but a lot of times if you're going to change out specific groups of cards, you're basically changing the archetype, and it's not a Jeff Stature Miles Morales movement deck anymore. It becomes something different entirely. So just be aware of that. Now, here are some of the flexible options. There wasn't too many to choose from that I felt comfortable with. These are just some things to think about that you can change in your deck. Nebula wasn't in the game when this deck was like really refined, but Nebula can definitely be swapped out for Nightcrawler if you bought Nebula, and it's definitely just a nice extra alternative option to play with. Cloak can be used in replacement of Jeff, but your opponent can also take advantage of the Cloak, so it's not the biggest benefit. I still think Jeff's a better card, so you could try it with Cloak, and it still probably will perform pretty well with Cloak, but it's still a little bit weaker to mention. And then Killmonger is kind of just a response to Nebula being in a lot of decks. Since Nebula's in a lot of decks, you can just add a Killmonger yourself to try to deal with that matchup. So that's just something you can start playing with to see if it works for you. The Moon Knight is something you could use instead of Black Bolt, but it's not as consistent because you are discarding your own cards, so you're giving yourself the chance to lose something really important. So you do have to be careful about that. But if you don't have Black Bolt and you really want to play the deck, you have all the other pieces. Like, don't let not having Black Bolt stop you from trying out the deck. Now here I usually put core card alternative options here, but there's really not. I talked about some of the alternative options in the previous slide, but I just want to reiterate, it's not the most flexible deck. You need Stature, you need Jeff, you need Darkhawk, you need Zabu, you need RockSlide, Black Bolt, the Polaris. There's like so many cards. This is a very expensive deck right now, so I definitely think if you have all these pieces, yeah, go ahead, try it. It's a strong deck. But if you don't have these pieces, you might feel frustrated because you're like, ooh, I just need Stature. Well, the deck doesn't work without Stature. I just need Jeff. Well, the deck feels more awkward without Jeff. So it's definitely a deck that requires a lot of different tools to make work. Now, when do you snap with this deck? I think if you have a Jeff advantage, so that's like, they play Professor X, but then your Jeff can win that lane regardless. Or you have a good Shang-Chi setup or a good Enchantress setup, right? Those are turns where you could snap and take advantage of it. When you just have a nice, good setup, because this deck is very draw dependent. So if you have Zabu into, RockSlide, into Black Bolt, Stature already in your hand, right? Like your setup is really good, then you can definitely snap into that. And then if you have a powerful turn 6 swing, so you have the Stature setup, you have the Miles setup, you have the Darkhawk or your tech card setup, and you're just playing a ton of really powerful turn 6 swings, well, that can be another reason to snap. So there's definitely a lot of ways to take advantage of this deck and really catch your opponent off guard. Now, what are some of the weaknesses of this deck? well, it's very draw and combo dependent. You need to draw your Black Bolt if you want your statue to work. You need to draw your RockSlide if you want your Darkhawk to work. You need to draw your Jeff or your Polaris if you want your Miles to work. You need to have a good Shang-Chi target or Enchantress target. You know, like a lot of your cards require lots of other setups in your deck, so your draws have to work together. Otherwise, it's just gonna feel very flat. And then you're weak to Leech, you're weak to Sandman, right? You're trying to flood in the final turns. If you get Leech or Sandman, you can't really flood very easily, so that's pretty disappointing. And then another weakness is you're much weaker without early Zabu. If you don't play Zabu on 3, you're not able to play RockSlide or any of your core 4-drops early on, and that can really mess it. It definitely feels a lot less smooth if you don't get that early Zabu. So it's definitely something to be looking for, especially if you're playing against this deck. If they don't have that early Zabu, it might be looking not that good for them or smooth in terms of how the deck seems to flow normally. And then last was, I initially had Enchantress timing, but you're really only hitting Darkhawk, so it's more of a tech card timing where Rogue and Enchantress and stuff like that can hit your Darkhawk. Or Cosmo can really mess you up, right? Because Cosmo can hit your Black Bolt, and it can just hit your RockSlide and stuff like that and really mess you up. So Cosmo could actually be a big counter here, but it's not like a normal thing people are thinking about. But tech card Shang-Chi, of course, still works. You do have to not have priority, and this deck is pretty easy to be behind until the last turn. So sometimes it's hard for you to get Shang-Chi because you're not ahead with this deck. So it's not the biggest weakness. The final ones. This deck is a good deck, so I actually struggled finding some reasonable weaknesses currently. There was actually not too much to think about since the deck has a lot of upsides to it. So it's one of the strongest decks in my opinion right now. So yeah, if the draws don't screw you, honestly, the deck is strong. So keep that in mind. And then here I have some build examples. So in a lot of these build examples, I changed like one card because I mean the deck is so rigid. Like it's hard to change things without like completely changing the deck. Because if you change one card, you have to change like 3 cards, and the deck is completely different. You don't have the same archetype. So here we just changed Nightcrawler from Nebula. This deck wasn't made with Nebula in the game, but I think Nebula fits that Nightcrawler spot, especially if you have Jeff and Polaris. They kind of do the job most of the time, and Nebula is such a strong 1-drop that I think it makes sense to try it with Nebula in and see if it feels a lot better for you. Next up, we change out the Jeff in case some people don't have Jeff. Obviously, you can try Cloak and see if it works out for you. It's weirder because your opponent can also take advantage of Cloak, so you do have to be like, is the Cloak good here? But if you really want to play the deck, you have all the other pieces, you can definitely try Cloak and see how it feels. And then next up is Moon Knight. If you want to play it, you can definitely play without Black Bolt, but if you want more discard synergies, you can definitely just put Black Bolt in. Once again, we took out something. We took out Jeff, right? Because a lot of people don't have Jeff, so I'm thinking, oh, if you don't have Jeff, you can play Moon Knight instead. You can also take out the Black Bolt and put Moon Knight there. You probably have to do more work though if you're doing that, because it means like maybe you're running like Ghost Rider or something like that just to take advantage of it. And then you're also probably maybe running like Black Cat. So the whole deck fundamentally changes if you see what I'm saying? Like a whole deck will change if you change a card. So it's a little bit harder to just plug and play one card in, one card out. But if you wanted to, you could definitely try Moon Knight and see how that feels for you. And then last off was just, I think I wanted to make a deck without Darkhawk in case people didn't have Darkhawk. And I thought this was a pretty good list, kind of using some of the same ideas with it. You don't have Miles anymore, so you're not relying on Miles to be the win condition. But you do have that Nebula, so it's more of a control deck that is taking Nebula, but you have the advantage of using that Black Bolt and Stature combo for it. So I thought this was a pretty decent list. It looked really good to me, and you can definitely try to see if it works out for you, especially if you don't have Darkhawk. But overall, the standard list is the standard list, and I would say like maybe the Nebula version is like the cleanest one in my eyes. But overall, that is the Jeff deck. A lot of people, I've never had this scene. A lot of people normally were asking, what is this deck? How do you run it? And I kind of wanted to make a video just explaining it. I thought this was the best way to do that. So if you like it, let me know. Thumbs in the comments. Subscribe, I guess. I've really never said that, but do the thing. And I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. Have a wonderful rest of your day. I messed up, by the way. I have to do editing for this one. What a disaster. That's put by. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills will be